Mercury News.
Chapter 4.
K.W. Klaver knew I was snooping around. An old friend of his, a retired sheriff's deputy like himself, had called from California and told him.
I called him and said, "Hey, KW, heads up. There's a reporter, an investigative reporter, is looking into the death of your late son."
But he didn't know I was coming to Oklahoma. He didn't know I would show up with a photographer that bright Monday morning at the Atoka livestock auction barn on the edge of town. I had come halfway across the country to ask him a brazen question, and I wasn't quite sure how to phrase it. How do you ask a man, 27 years later, about the night his 10-year-old son Josh was found hanging in the family barn? How do you ask if the boy's death, long ruled a suicide, was something more?
I have to ask.
How do you ask a man if he killed his son? Atoka is a small town on Oklahoma's southeastern plains, a place best known for tornadoes and team roping. We found the tastiest catfish at the truck stop on the highway into town. Downtown, tinny speakers filled the sidewalks with sounds of Elvis, Perry Como, and Charlie Pride. Just like this. There's a street named after Reba McEntire near the county courthouse, where the 10 Commandments are etched in blocks of granite out front. KW moved here from San Martin, California, with his wife and 3 kids in 2004. He had been forced to retire on disability from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department because of back problems. That hasn't kept him from the roping arena outside of town on jackpot roping nights, where Kim Burkhalter also competes.
More than rope today? I don't know. He didn't bring one. He's a friend of mine, and I had no problem with him at all. If he bothered anybody around here, people around here wouldn't stand for it. I mean, we're pretty we're willing to defend what we got, put it that way.
But I had heard plenty of disturbing things about KW before I got to Oklahoma. That he had a history of abusing Josh, that he'd been violent and had bullied his ex-wives and daughters and threatened to shoot an ex-girlfriend. All claims he denied. I came here not only to try to talk to KW, but to find people who might know a different side to this man. As you'll hear later, one of them, in an anonymous call, made a point to find me. As Burkhalter unloaded his horses, he told me KW fits right in here. He sold KW hay and says, "He treated me good and paid me on time."
He's a little different, but he's from California. Everybody in California is a little different. I'm kidding, but...
KW lives on 135 acres a few miles west of Atoka, where he raises some cattle and keeps horses. Most of his family who lived here with him, his ex-wife and 2 of his 3 grown children, have all moved to Minnesota. I had just come from the Minnesota town of Winona. That's where I interviewed KW's ex-wife, Bobby. They had been married for 25 years before he asked for a divorce in 2010. I had set out to interview Bobby and KW, the 2 people who discovered the tragedy in 1989 in the Klaver barn. Bobby had come home that night to find KW in the house and Josh hanging in the barn. We heard Bobby's emotional story in Chapter 3. But since you probably could use a quick refresher, here goes. We've heard how Josh's mother, Kathy Atkins, who never married KW, had tried for years to get investigators to take a closer look at Josh's death. She insists KW's law enforcement buddies overlooked concerns spelled out in family court files that KW had abused their son. We also heard from some of those original investigators who told me they never suspected anything more than suicide, that the 10-year-old boy was distraught over being caught in his parents' bitter tug-of-war. They never doubted KW's story. But in 2014, the Santa Clara County Sheriff decided to take another look into Josh's death. Bobby and KW had divorced by then, and another of his ex-lovers had reached out to Josh's mother to suggest Bobby had questions about what happened that night in the barn. Now, my journey had brought me to KW. To ask the delicate questions that had been swirling around him for years, questions his fellow deputies never pressed him on, but ones that, in fairness to KW, needed to be asked, in person. I wanted to hear what the man himself had to say. Maybe KW had the answers that would end years of speculation. As Bobby had told me on her doorstep in Minnesota, if I wanted to know what happened, ask KW. He was the only one there that night. Here in Atoka, a town of 3,000, it wasn't difficult to find out that KW spends most Monday mornings at the sale barn. He hangs out with a group of regulars, checking in on the price of cattle. Photographer Lipo Ching and I arrived in our little Nissan rental car late last summer. The dirt parking lot was filling up with big pickups, dualies they call them, the kind of hefty trucks with the double sets of tires on the back to haul trailers. I didn't know for sure whether KW would even be there, much less talk to me. I wasn't sure I'd recognize him either. I'd only seen old photos. But I hit the record button on my phone as I wandered through the auction barn. With about 24 cowboys milling through, I asked around. I'm looking for KW.
KW, I think he just pulled up right there. He just pulled up right there.
Oh, great, thanks. I walked out the door and spotted him heading to the cattle pens. There he was, wearing that big bushy mustache draping down his chin. It's the same one he had nearly 40 years ago when he met Josh's mother at a San Jose country western bar. The mustache was a distinguishing feature listed in petitions that women had filed for restraining orders against him in recent years. I called out to him and got a little help from the guys. KW!
Hey, no! Come here, boy.
Where is he? Oh, did you go around the corner?
There he is right there.
I took a deep breath. I was about to come face to face with the man who was the last to see Josh alive and the first to find him dead. The subject of a renewed Sheriff's Department probe that had sent investigators just about everywhere. But here, I had been dissecting his life for months, wondering just what he was capable of. Would he even talk to me? Would he be furious and run me off?
Hey, I'd like to talk to you.
KW's 59 years old now and looked bigger than I expected. His shirt was untucked and a feather stuck up from the band of his cowboy hat. I introduced myself. I'm a reporter for the Mercury News in San Jose, I told him. I want to talk to you. I'm doing a story about Josh.
First off, why are you doing a story about Josh?
Well, because there's been a lot of questions about what happened to him, and I just wanted to...
Questions raised by his mother.
Right.
Yeah, his mother's been beating that tambourine for years.
What do you think about that? Why do you think she's doing that?
Look.
And so began a 40-minute interview, standing next to a corral of restless cattle, and boy, you're going to hear him, trying to find out what happened the night Josh died, when father and son were left home alone together. KW had a searing squint as he talked, catching my eye each time I looked up from my notebook.
Look. Give me your card first.
Sure.
I had custody of him for years because she was a drug addict and couldn't take care of him.
Can we sit down and talk about this?
No. No.
Okay, so you had custody for years and she...
She was a drug addict and she gave him up. She gave him up like a dog. I took him. I raised him for a number of years. And then she sought custody. Okay? So whatever you've been told, and I already know that you've talked to the officers.
Right.
Okay? And you already know that the officers told you everything was on the up and up. Okay? So, I had custody of him. Okay? She sought custody of him. We fought over it for 2 or 3 years. The judge said that she'd never displayed a responsible attitude. Okay? And that she deserved a chance as the birth mother. He'd already ran away from her house.
Can I record this just so I
No.
can...
So, confession. I left my recorder on for the rest of the interview. It helps me to ensure the accuracy of everything I wrote down in my notebook. In Oklahoma, you don't need the other person's consent to record a conversation. Still, to respect KW's wishes, I've decided not to play the rest of his responses. Just tell you what he said. Now you know what he sounds like, and the conviction of his words. For the rest of this interview, you're only going to hear me. So, here we go. The two of us standing next to a cattle pen, dust kicking up as trucks pull in and out of the parking lot, and cows mooing, sometimes so loud we had to stop as we talked. Yeah, like that. This is what he told me. He insisted he had nothing to do with his son's death, that he was a good father, that he loved his son, fought for him, did everything he could for him. He said he was a great dad. Josh was a good kid, but had emotional issues, and yes, he said, the custody battle with Josh's mother had something to do with it. I've seen what tug-of-wars have done to a lot of children, he told me, and it's not good. I asked if he thought he played a role in that. His answer, I did what I thought was best at the time. He said he did the honorable thing in the first place, by taking Josh in when the boy was a toddler and his mother was battling drug problems. When Josh's mother came back into his life, KW said, she couldn't handle his emotions and sent him to an institution more than once. And quickly, KW delivered a blunt explanation of what happened to his son. Josh killed himself that night, he said, because the boy wanted to live with him, not his mother. That's the end of the story, he told me. That's all there is to it, and Kathy will not accept that fact, so she wants to blame others. So here we are, almost 30 years later. KW is blaming Kathy, and Kathy is blaming him, and sadly, maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise. But stick with me here, because it's important to remember the who's and the what's and the why's as we listen to the recounting of my interview with KW. Remember, Kathy contends that the night before Josh died, at the end of a weekend visit with her, he said he didn't want to go back to his dad's, so she refused to return him. That's what set up the showdown that followed, the tense dynamic that preceded the tragedy in the barn, the Klavers being granted permission to take Josh home that night, the hearing that was supposed to happen the next morning, where Josh, for the first time, might tell a judge where he wanted to live. Josh died before that could happen. So, could Josh's death have come down to this? With whom he wanted to live? And could we ever really know for sure? In KW's telling of the story, he was clear. Josh wanted to live with him and was not upset, as Kathy told it, when he picked him up from her house on the day he died. But there were so many critical details he didn't recall about that day, or said were too painful to remember, as he asked me, how would you like to come home and find your son that way?
Can you tell me what happened that night?
It's not that I came here expecting a confession, but I hoped, if KW talked to me at all, that he would clear up what happened between Josh and him before his wife came home that night. No matter how many ways I asked, KW said he didn't remember a single thing he might have said to Josh, or what Josh might have said to him. The only thing he clearly remembered, he said, is that he cut Josh down, and he and Bobby performed CPR. KW said he had no idea that the case had been reopened in 2014, that the coroner had returned to his old barn and tried to reenact the hanging, that detectives had been talking to his ex-wives and Josh's mother. So I told him some of what I knew.
Detectives have been in the last year or so have been asking people if they think you're capable of murder.
Absolutely not, he told me. Not then, not now. He emphasized that the investigation was done into Josh's death on multiple occasions by numerous people. It was always ruled a suicide, he said. But Josh's mother, quote, won't handle that. She's the only one. Everybody else handles it just fine. So I asked him about the first investigation, the night of Josh's death, whether he believed his fellow deputies might have given him special treatment. No, he told me. He knew that I had already talked to some of the officers there that night and, quote, they told you, whenever you're an officer, they look at you twice as hard.
Mm-hmm. Unless, I'm just being devil's advocate, unless they're your friends.
But KW told me they weren't his friends, and that they wouldn't put themselves on the line like that they did their jobs equally and without bias. I asked him about the rope that was used in Josh's hanging. It never made its way to the coroner.
There are questions about what happened to the rope, that the rope was missing, and the chair, and what happened to the rope?
All I know, he told me, is the officers took everything into evidence, that there was an investigation into the suicide, it was closed as a suicide, and the evidence was destroyed by the agency. That's all I know. Well, wait a minute. Destroyed? The rope was destroyed? Why? And what did that mean? The coroner, both at Josh's autopsy and during the reenactment of the hanging just 3 years ago, told me the rope should have been preserved for their investigations. Still, even without the rope, the coroner had concluded Josh's death was a suicide. I asked KW about the abuse. 8 acts were documented by Santa Clara County Family Court Judge James Stewart in the custody battle over Josh.
There were times, I guess, when you were called to the school about bruises he had, and a lot of deputies were there, and Josh was interviewed with you there. Did you ever feel like, what did you think about that? You were accused of causing these bruises, and apparently he said that you knocked him down the back steps.
KW denied all of that. None of it happened, he said. He never hit his kids, he insisted. And when I asked how he would discipline them, his answer? Timeouts. I pressed him on what happened the night of Josh's death. Surely he must remember what his ex-wife Bobby had told me just a few days earlier. That KW and Josh were in the barn together. That Josh was upset. That KW gave the boy a big hug to calm him down. That KW returned to the house while Josh fed the rabbits in the barn. KW had explained this to Bobby after she came home that night, and they found Josh hanging. But he said he didn't remember any of that. Why not? I wondered. Was the trauma too great? Did the years dull his memory? Or was he just unwilling to tell me? He said his memories of Josh being upset aren't of that day, but are of Josh being upset leading up to that day. Besides, he said, before Bobby returned that night, he was on the phone almost the whole time, talking to a friend. The time had come to ask the toughest questions. I braced myself. I asked him if he thought Josh was afraid of him. No, he said.
When he was upset that night, did you go into the barn? Was he upset? Did you try and calm him down?
He didn't remember. It's so painful, he said.
Do you remember, like, if he was, just try to think about it for a bit here. Like, that night, he was going to feed the rabbits or something, and maybe you went out and... Did you try to calm him down, try to restrain him, hug him real tight, or do you remember anything like that?
I always hugged my kids, KW told me. I always hugged my kids real tight.
Could something have happened that you hugged him so tight and took the wind out of him?
Absolutely not. No, KW told me. It's not like that. It's not like that. It was a very unfortunate incident. It was a suicide. It was already investigated multiple times, and that's what it was. I'm really sorry that I lost a child to suicide.
I have to ask, did you restrain him in such a way that he might have passed out? That maybe he died and it was an accident?
Absolutely not, he told me. You're getting into something now that just never happened. I loved him, he said, and did everything I could for him. I have to say, I was really surprised with KW's willingness to hear what I had come to ask him. Some really difficult questions and brutal accusations. While he didn't provide all the answers, he never walked away. And perhaps that should have been the end of the interview. But the hug thing was still nagging at me. Hugging Josh was something his stepson from his first marriage said KW never did. KW said he doesn't remember hugging Josh that night, but as he put it, I always held him tightly when he was upset.
And so was he upset that night and you...
He didn't answer. Instead, in a startling moment, the former deputy sheriff sidled up to me at the edge of the corral. He wrapped his arm firmly around my shoulder and pulled me in. So we were standing there, side by side, so close that the brim of his cowboy hat nearly touched my forehead. He looked me straight in the eye. "Is this holding tightly?" he asked. "This is what I did to my kids. This is what I did to my kids when they were upset, when I talked to them." There we stood for a full 20 seconds. KW is looking down at me. I am looking up at him, neither of us blinking. The moment went on so long, honestly, I had time to contemplate several possibilities. One of them was this. Was there truth in his eyes? If someone looks you straight in the eye long and hard when he says he did nothing to harm his child, should you believe him? If you look straight back, can you see into his soul? Then he let go. When you hear that KW is under investigation, maybe that there was some foul play involved in Josh's death, what's your reaction to that?
I think it's completely ridiculous. Okay, completely.
That's David Sussman, who represented KW in his drawn-out custody battle with Josh's mother.
It makes no sense to me, that's all. I always thought he was pretty straight with me. When things didn't go correctly or there were errors made, I don't ever remember him running away. I never found him to lack courage.
KW's lawyer wasn't the only one to take his side. During my trip to Atoka, I received a call from a woman who heard I was running around the sale barn asking questions. My colleague Lipo and I were on our way to see the historical marker where, as local lore has it, Bonnie and Clyde, or at least Clyde Barrow, survived a shootout. I pulled over to answer.
With whom am I speaking?
I'm not going to tell you that. But I am going to tell you that you most certainly haven't done your homework very well. Because you're trying to dig up dirt on somebody where it doesn't exist.
She refused to identify herself, saying only that she was a friend of KW's. But she was intent on convincing me that any suspicions about KW were false and that they were the work of a scorned ex-girlfriend. If KW has problems, she said, it's because of women. That's his only problem. Women absolutely love this man, she said. Women are attracted to him.
You were bamboozled, madam, into coming out here.
KW had tried to convince me of the same thing. Along with blaming Josh's mother for their son's death, he had accused his ex-girlfriend of being a thorn in my side and stirring up false rumors. At one point, KW told me, "If you're truly a reporter, you will not do the story one-sided. You will do this correctly." There was something else about my interview at the auction barn that stuck with me. It happened at the end, when I thought the interview was over. As I was sitting in my rental car reviewing my notes, KW walked across the dusty parking lot, through the trucks and trailers to my window. I rolled it down. He leaned in, again, close. "If you're any judge of character," he said, "you can see I look you right in the eye when I say it's devastating, and I'm telling you, it's very painful." KW was asking me to judge his character, so I asked him again about the abusive behavior, confirmed by a judge when Josh was 7, spelled out by his 2 grown daughters in petitions for restraining orders in 2010, and alleged by his 2 former wives. Bobby Klaver had even written that he threatened to kill her and fired a gun at her feet, saying, "It will be that quick." KW told me that never happened. I treated women well. Yes, verbal arguments, but I've never been physical with a woman or children. I tried to give him some leeway. I asked if perhaps he saw himself as a strict disciplinarian back then, one whose behavior wouldn't have been seen as abuse decades ago. But he denied that as well. "I think a lot of that child abuse was created by that woman trying to get custody," he said of Josh's mother, "because it didn't happen."
See, that's the hard thing, because if it's just about who's telling the truth, right? I mean, you're asking me to believe you, not believe things other people have said in these court papers. How do I know who to believe?
It's a question I'd been asking myself for months. But KW had a question for me, one that Josh's mother had been asking for decades, one that I couldn't readily answer. If I was guilty of child abuse, he asked me, how come I was never charged? Next time on Hanging.
10-year-olds are not even they're not going through puberty. The kid was scared.
Usually when you deal with homicides that are being disguised as a suicide by hanging, you usually find more internal injuries, and that was not found in this particular case.
I'm telling you, the 2 deputies and Deputy Klaver were totally attempting to intimidate me.
It was very hard not to wonder whether if I had done something different in the custody order, it would have made a difference. So that's the type of thing that you don't forget as a judge.
Does it strike you as odd that you didn't have that Judge Stewart finding for the child death review team?
Well, this is the first time I'm hearing of it.
Hanging is an original podcast series from the Mercury News in San Jose. This podcast was hosted and reported by Julia Prodis Sulek. That's me. It was produced by my editor, Mike Frankel, and our sound engineer, Paul Baca. Videos and photography by Lipo Ching. Additional video production by Tor Haugen and Sarah Dussault. Our website is designed by Pi, and Mike Mayer designed the series for the newspaper. Bert Robinson is our managing editor, and Neil Chase is our executive editor. To make sure you hear every chapter, subscribe to Hanging wherever you get your podcasts. To see photos, videos, and documents, and to read the series and comment on this podcast, go to www.mercurynews.com/hanging. That's Mercury, like the planet, news.com/hanging. Thanks for listening.